Hi guys, welcome to Beklaedt's YouTube channel. If you are new to this channel, then make sure to subscribe so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks and much more. My name is Eben and in this video I'll show you how I sew the blouse Birk. This blouse is extremely simple to make, which makes it very beginner friendly. The blouse only has two pattern pieces, a front and back piece. The boat neck gives a feminine touch and makes the blouse very easy to wear. Both the neckline and armholes are finished with bias binding. The blouse can also be made into a dress. You can buy the sewing pattern for both on my website Beklaedt.com. Okay, I would like to make this video as beginner friendly as possible, so even people with no sewing experience will be able to follow along. I'll start by presenting the tools we need. We need a scissor, tailor's chalk, pins, needles, a measuring tape and a seam ripper, because even the best sewist makes mistakes. We also need a ruler. Any kind of ruler is fine. Then we obviously also need a sewing machine. And then I would strongly recommend you to have your iron and ironing board ready too. These were the tools, but we also need material to sew in. For the blouse I'm using a soft woven cotton in black and white checks. Cotton is a very beginner-friendly material to work with. If you want to use second-hand fabrics, then most bedding, curtains and tablecloths are made of cotton, which is suitable for this project. We also need bias binding and of course sewing thread. The two pattern pieces we'll be using look like this. The pattern pieces are shown in halves. The vertical edge where it says CF and CB, which stands for center front and center back, lays directly on the central line of the body. If you draw a vertical line down your torso, you will have two halves that are mirror images of each other, connected by the CF and CB line. When we cut out the fabric, we will lay the fabric double, so we automatically cut two identical halves connected by the CF and CB line. But before that, we just need to trim away the seam allowance along the armholes, as we won't be needing seam allowance to finish the sleeveless blouse. When you're ready, it's time to lay the pattern pieces on top of the fabric. I start by laying the fabric in a double layer along the grain line, that is, the length of the fabric. Place your pattern pieces so the CB and CF line is aligned with the folded edge. Attach the paper pattern with pins or by using pattern weights. Then you can cut the pattern pieces out. Do the same for the other pattern piece and voila, we have our front and back pieces. First step is to mark the position of the bust dart on the front piece. In case you don't know what a dart is, it is a fold you make to add shape to the garment, typically around a woman's breast or hip. Place the paper pattern on top of the wrong side of the fabric. That is, the side which will face inwards towards the body, and place a pin by each leg of the dart. Then fold the paper pattern by the apex of the dart and place another pin to mark this point. Do the same on the other side by flipping the paper pattern. Match the two top pins with each other, whereby the dart is shaped towards the apex pin. Pin the apex pin through both layers. It can be a great help to draw the dart line onto the fabric with tailor's chalk afterwards. Set the stitch length between 2 and 3 and start stitching by the top of the dart. Remember to secure the stitch by going back and forward. Stitch at a slow pace to maintain control. Secure the stitch again by the apex of the dart. Bring the front piece to the ironing board and press the darts toward CF, that is, towards the middle of the blouse. You get the best result by pressing your darts with the iron. Now we need to finish the raw edges of the shoulder seams, side seams, and the hemline of the blouse on both the front and back pieces. We do this to prevent the fabric from unraveling. I finish my seams with my overlocker, but if you don't have an overlocker, you can make a regular zigzag stitch right by the edge of the fabric instead. Okay, now it's time to add bias binding to the neckline on both the front and back. I'll start on the back piece. Place the back piece flat on the table so the right side is facing up. Find the bias binding and cut a piece that matches the length of the neckline plus a few extra centimeters on either side. Open up the bias binding and align the open edge with the neckline. Pin the bias binding to the neckline with lots of pins. Do the same on the front piece. Place the front piece flat on the table so the right side is facing up. Pin the bias binding to the neckline with lots of pins. Stitch a binding in place by stitching directly down at the fold line. Stitch at a slow pace to maintain control. I know it can be tricky to stitch directly at the fold line, but the more you practice, the easier it becomes. Do this for both the front and back piece. When the bias binding has been stitched to the pieces, we need to fold the bias binding around the edge so it fully encloses the edge. Place the back piece flat on the table so the wrong side faces up. Fold the bias binding around the neckline so the stitch from before is covered under the bias binding. Place lots of pins. Do the same on the front piece. Most people find it a little tricky, but we need to stitch the bias binding in place from the right side. This means that you should place the fabric so the right side is facing up and the folded edge of the bias binding is hidden under the fabric. Use your fingers to feel if the folded edge is laying correctly. Stitch the binding in place a couple of millimeters from the edge of the binding, so we catch the other edge of the binding through the fabric. I know it can be intimidating to sew like this, where you can't see if the needle catches the bias binding on the wrong side. But it just gives the best result to do it this way. If you absolutely don't like it, then stitch the bias binding in place from the wrong side. The most important thing is to finish the blouse. Look at this beautiful finish. Place the front piece flat on the table so the right side faces up. Place the back piece directly on top so the right side of the back piece faces towards the right side of the front piece. Pin the two pieces together by the two shoulder seams. Stitch the shoulder seams together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Bring the pieces to the ironing board and press the shoulder seams open. Trim away the surplus bias binding so the binding aligns with the seam allowance from the shoulder seam. We need to enforce the bias binding in the corner between the front and back neckline. Stitch directly on top of the previous stitching about 1 cm before the corner. Stitch to the shoulder seam, place the needle down, lift up the presser foot and pivot the fabric so you can continue stitching back and forward on the other side. Now it's time to finish the armhole with bias binding like we did the neckline. Place the blouse flat on the table so the right side faces up and the shoulder seam is open. Cut a piece of bias binding that matches the length of the armhole plus a few extra centimeters. Do like before, open up the bias binding and align the open edge with the armhole all the way around. Place lots of pins. Please remember to let the shoulder seam be open. Do the same on the other armhole. Stitch the bias binding in place by stitching right in the fold line. Just like I showed you before, fold the bias binding around the edge so the bias binding covers the armhole completely. Stitch the bias binding in place from the right side a couple of millimeters inside the binding that catches the other edge through the fabric. Do this for both armholes. Now it's time to finish the side seams. Place the blouse flat on the table so the two right sides face each other. Place pins along the two side seams. Stitch the side seams with a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish by pressing the side seams open with your iron. Press the hemline of the blouse 2 cm towards the wrong side and place pins all the way around. Then iron the hemline in place. It makes quite a big difference to press the hemline before stitching it. Before bringing the blouse back to the sewing machine, I trim away the surplus bias binding from the armholes. Stitch the hem in place about 2 cm from the edge. I recommend to always finish hemlines from the right side because it gives a more even seam. I know that a lot of beginners prefer to finish a hemline from the wrong side, but I don't think that's a good idea. If you press the hemline very meticulously before stitching it, your seam will automatically pierce through both layers. The final thing we need to do is to secure the bias binding under the armholes, just like I showed you for the neckline. And that was it. That wasn't too bad, am I right? When you have finished this blouse, I would encourage you to make the dress version of Birk, which is included in the same sewing pattern. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a like and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching!